Hello and welcome back to another edition of The Front Page. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal. Pleasure to be here with you again. It's a pleasure to have also as my guest today Mr. Oliver Olsen, who is the representative from the district, as we say over here, on the other side of the mountain. Let me see if I can remember all the towns that are in your district, Oliver. Winhall, Londonderry, Stratton, Jamaica, Weston, and that's
Londonderry?
it. Londonderry. I knew I was going to forget somebody. So anyway, well, great to have you with us, Oliver. And congratulations, I guess, are in order for completing the first year of a term. As many of you know, Oliver took over Rick Hubie's unexpired 1 year of his term after Rick's unfortunate passing last year around Christmas. And Oliver, you took office under very sad circumstances. I know that you and Rick were very good friends and worked closely together. It must have been a very tough time.
It was, Andrew. Rick was a great friend to, not just to me, but everyone in the community. He was well known, liked, respected, and loved by many people in the community. And his passing, hit me and hit a number of people in our community. But Rick was also a great mentor as well as a great friend, and I learned a lot from him, and it was very helpful going into the legislative session.
Well, you were appointed by the governor back last January, and now we've completed a session. So tell me, what was it like? I mean, was it about what you expected, or were you surprised by some of the behind-the-scenes current of the legislature?
Well, Andrew, I think if you were to speak with even some of the more seasoned veterans in the legislature, they would tell you that every year brings a surprise and something new. And that is one of the fascinating things about the legislative process is every year we deal with some old issues, but we deal with a lot of new issues, and we learn a lot throughout the process. So I would say that I learned a lot, but I think every legislator learns something new every year.
Well, let's talk about some of the things that came up and how you wrapped up the session and a few of the issues that probably are still out there that are yet to be dealt with. I mean, first of all, the budget was obviously a big issue for the entire legislature, and as it will be again next year. We can talk about that in a minute. The legislature and the governor came up with a compromise at the end of the session that avoided a last-minute showdown, I guess. What is your take on that settlement? I mean, I think it probably surprised a lot of people that the executive and the legislative branches came to an agreement and closed a budget gap that started off at around $150 million. Was that compromise a good one in your opinion, or was there something left on the table there?
Well, Andrew, I think with any compromise, there's going to be good and bad, depending on which side of the table you sit on, and that's the nature of compromise. It involves people making concessions on things that they rather not, and in exchange, you get something that you want from that agreement. And I think the budget, in large part, does represent that. There are certainly a lot of things that I liked about the budget. There are many things that I did have concerns with, namely that there's roughly an $8 million hole in the budget because we didn't fulfill our mission with Challenges for Change, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But one of the big accomplishments, and it's not in the budget per se, but in a closely related bill, the miscellaneous tax bill, we actually were able to dial back some of the tax increases that the legislature pushed through over the governor's objections last year. So we saw that big showdown last year between the governor and the legislature. There were a number of tax increases that were pushed through over his objection, and we were actually able to scale some of those tax increases back this year. And that, I think, is a big win for Vermont taxpayers and Vermont as a whole, and certainly makes us more competitive as we look to rebuild our economy.
Well, now you're going to have about another $120 million roughly to try and eliminate from the state budget next year in fiscal year 2012.
Correct.
What do you think the chances are that nut will be cracked? I mean, those are big dollars in Vermont terms.
Very big dollars. And to put that into perspective, we had a $154 million gap that we had to fill this year. The $122 million is an addition to the $154 million in savings this year. So those are cumulative savings we need to build upon. There are two significant variables in play that will determine just how challenging that process will be next year. The first is how quickly our economy rebounds, and as our economy rebounds, so do our tax revenues. As those tax revenues go up, the gap begins to shrink. The other big unknown is challenges for change, which is this cost savings initiative that we passed out this year that's projected to save $38 million in savings. That's the target, at least, and we really won't know until later later this year and early next year as to whether or not that's successful. Now, those savings are meant to be long-term sustainable savings. If we don't see the results by the end of this year, or start to see those results bear fruit, that's going to create an even bigger problem in the next fiscal year.
Well, let's talk a little bit about challenges for change for a second. I know I think that was a concept that was very hard for a lot of people outside of Montpelier to understand. I mean, I think we get the basic idea that it was an attempt to sort of overhaul government or make it more efficient, that sort of thing. But I mean, how different was it from ordinary, if that's the right word, attempts to kind of make spending more efficient and make government operate more efficiently? It seemed like it was a different approach altogether.
It certainly is a different approach. Many people call it an experimental approach, and it is very experimental in some ways. In other ways, it's not. What Challenges for Change seeks to do is something that many private enterprises do when they face difficult times. And at its very heart, what it attempts to do is to get people to think outside the box. And it starts with a target. So very early on in the session, we established a target of $38 million in savings that we are looking to achieve for fiscal 11. And we basically said, here's the target. We need to find those savings, and they can't just be one-time savings. They actually have to be long-term sustainable savings, and that's the key piece of this. And asked everyone within government, including the legislature and the administration, to work together to try to find ways that we could either save money or bring in new enterprise type revenue. And one thing that I saw that was very positive out of it is there were a lot of people who were looking at things through a different lens and actually looking at alternative ways of doing business within state government, ways that we can re-engineer state government. And there was a lot of positive discussion, and a lot of things that would have been off the table a few years ago were now on the table, and people were willing to talk about it. And from that standpoint, I think the process was was a good one overall. I had a number of concerns with some specific elements of the process, with some of the projected savings and how we went about the speed at which we went about the process. There were a few little bumps in the road there, but overall, I think it's put us. It's got people thinking outside the box, but it remains to be seen whether it will actually deliver on that savings target that we saw.
Well, when will we know if it's been successful at delivering on those savings targets? So is that something we'll know by December or before the start of the next session?
We'll certainly know. In fact, every quarter there's going to be a report delivered on how we're measuring up against the targets that we've set ourselves, and it's designed to be an ongoing process. So hopefully by December, January, we should have a pretty good sense of whether or not we're actually meeting that target that we set for ourselves, and that's the big unknown, the variable that I spoke about earlier.
Is this a kind of an outlook on state spending that you see extending across the entire budget, or is this going to be kind of a more limited kind of scope?
Well, the intent of Challenges for Change was to to be expansive and look across state government and look for those opportunities to save money. And I think depending on what we actually see in terms of savings at the beginning of the next calendar year and at the end of the fiscal year, next June, will really determine the fate of this methodology or this approach.
Okay. Well, let's talk also a little bit about another major topic that's always a perennial issue, I suppose, around Vermont, and that, I think you mentioned it earlier, actually, the whole question of economic development. Yeah. Obviously, a $120 million deficit becomes a lot easier to solve if the economy rebounds and the recession comes to an end and tax revenues return to healthier levels. Assuming, however, that the recession more or less grinds on the way it's been going and things don't get any worse but don't get appreciably better either, I mean, what do you see as being the long-term strategy that a state like Vermont should employ when it comes to economic development? This has been talked about a lot, about how we want to get certain types of industries here, or Vermont would be a good place for some kind of a business or another, but how do you see that really happening, or what do we need to do?
Well, Andrew, I think there are a number of things that we need to be looking at, and there is no silver bullet out there, and certainly our tax climate and our regulatory climate are part of the equation. But it wouldn't be fair to pin all of our hopes on that as a fix. There are other issues as well. We are a relatively small state. We're also an aging state. We need to keep in mind that we are the second oldest state in the nation, and that's really a reflection on the size of our workforce. And we certainly have a lot of highly skilled people who live here, who are of working age, but are looking for work. I mean, we do have a relatively high unemployment rate at the moment, but where we have a challenge is we don't have a critical mass of certain skill sets. So if you're a company and you're looking to relocate to Vermont and you're looking to bring 100 or 200 jobs to the state, you need to find 100 or 200 people with those skills. And we may have 5 or 10 people who are out of work who are looking for a job that have those skills, but do we have 200 people with those particular skills? And that's a function of being a relatively small state, and that's why we need to look for ways that we can encourage development of small businesses and medium-sized businesses, and also focus on retention. And that's one thing that we lose sight of. We need to do more to keep our businesses who already exist in Vermont here and provide opportunities for them to expand and grow within the state organically, rather than looking to move out of state, which is something that unfortunately we see too much of in the state.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you go around your district and you talk to small business owners, I mean, what do they tell you? Do they tell you, gosh, if only I wasn't spending so much in taxes, I'd be able to hire more people? Or is it a question of healthcare, that healthcare costs are too high, or do they feel that they're being hamstrung by something else that you could really say the state has some kind of leverage over? Because I think there are probably a lot of factors out there that a small business person in any state in the union would say, gee, but for this, I could do more things.
Well, when I speak with small business owners in my district, taxes are really the number one issue that I hear about, and their issue is different than, say, a large company coming into Vermont. They're already doing business here, and a lot of our local economy, particularly in my district, is built around the tourism and second home market. Mm-hmm. And so, in fact, I was just speaking with a plumbing contractor yesterday who does a lot of work up around the Stratton area, and he had, just a few years ago, 25 employees. He's down to 5 employees, and he's telling me that the thing that's killing his business are property taxes. And what he's finding is that there are second homeowners who, they're feeling the pinch just like we all are, mm-hmm. But they still have to make their property tax payment. And they're making their property tax payment. What they're not doing is investing in, a new kitchen or a new bathroom in their house. And that's where he's really seeing a lot of the pain.
So, how do we fix that? I mean, that's a major question, and one we're not going to answer right here, I suppose. But I guess that sort of is the logical segue then into education spending, because education spending and property taxes are pretty closely linked. I mean, we've had lengthy conversations about education spending in the past, and the numbers are very familiar to probably just about everybody about how we have a declining number of students in the state. We have one of the smallest student-teacher ratios in the country, and yet education spending seems to be hard to budge. Now, I think a lot of school boards did a great job last year, my personal opinion anyway, holding the line, but I don't think we're seeing the kind of decline in education spending, and therefore property taxes that would be necessary to address the concerns of your plumbing contractor there, for instance.
It's a tough issue, Andrew, and it has been a perennial issue for the past 11 or 12 years. But to your point about education spending and the job that school boards have done, education spending across the state for fiscal 11 is going to be about 0% in terms of an increase compared to the last fiscal year. To the credit of the school boards, who really did everything they could to sharpen the pencils and to keep those budgets level. However, under the Challenges for Change program, there's actually provision in there that is asking for our school boards to reduce spending by 2% in fiscal 12, but it's a voluntary request. There's no substantive policy changes or anything that's going to empower the school boards to actually make those reductions. They're just asking them if they would be so kind as to reduce their budgets by 2%. It would be much appreciated and would save the state over $20 million. And I think that's an unrealistic expectation. I think we need to be looking at some substantive changes within the overall governance structure, as well as the spending and the funding side of the equation. But there just hasn't been the appetite in Montpelier, quite frankly, Andrew, to really take a hard look at our education financing system, both spending and funding. But we're going to really see a pretty big impact in fiscal 12. We're looking at a lot of federal money that's going to be drying up, roughly $38 million that flows directly to the school districts that will be going away. At the same time, they're going to be asked to reduce spending by 2%. We're seeing a very large uptick in income sensitivity, or otherwise known as prebate payments, because of the economy and people's incomes are lower. That is all funded out of the education fund. So that puts more pressure on the education fund. And all those things together, as well as a contraction in the statewide grand list, add up to a need for potentially a very large property tax increase unless we do something radically different with our education financing system, which unfortunately is going to be a day late and a dollar short, because by the time we get back up to Montpelier in January, school boards will have already pretty much have their budgets ready to go.
Mm-hmm. Doesn't sound like a very good situation at all. One of the approaches that has been talked about a fair amount is some kind of consolidation. Whether it's shrinking the number of supervisory unions, or combining school districts, or even, I guess, the extreme end of the spectrum, closing schools. I mean, that sounds like where the dollars really lie if we're going to achieve anything remotely close to a 2% reduction. But as we all know, that's a very difficult pill for a lot of folks to swallow. Local control is a big part of the whole tradition of Vermont, and when we start talking about consolidation of school districts and supervisory unions, that seems to hit square up against that. So where do we go from here then, if we're going to try and get those kinds of savings?
Well, Andrew, I think consolidation is certainly has to be part of the mix, and we did pass a bill earlier this year, actually towards the end of the session, that provides a program, an incentive program for voluntary school district consolidation. And it's important to keep in mind that school district consolidation is a very different animal than school consolidation. The theory goes that school district consolidation will, in the long term, lead to school consolidation where it makes sense, where it's appropriate. So the bill that we passed at the end of the session provides a voluntary program for school districts to look at consolidating their governance structures, and the thinking is that a larger board with responsibility for a number of schools will be more likely to take the holistic view and look at consolidating schools if it makes sense for the students in terms of their educational opportunities, geography, those sorts of things, as well as cost savings. But that's a long-term initiative. That's not going to reduce spending by 2% in fiscal 12. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
So we need to look at some of the mandates that we place as a state on our local school districts and our schools and our teachers. Unfortunately, there are a number of federal mandates, including the No Child Left Behind and all of the mandates associated with that, that school districts are required to comply with, and these mandates cost money. The other big one is special education. That's sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and that's a federal mandate. It's very important to the needs of many students, and it's something that we have to look at carefully. We can't obviously we can't cut special ed, but we need to look at how we can better deliver our special education services, and also find a different way to pay for them. And one of the problems now is that these special ed costs are borne by the local districts, and it can have a disproportionate impact on how their property tax rates are calculated. So one of the things that's been discussed over the last few years, and my predecessor, Rick Hubie, was really a leading proponent for looking at this, is as a potential for having the state take over responsibility for the funding. Not to say that they would necessarily be responsible entirely for the delivery, but at least this way the school districts would be held harmless from the effect of having several students with special needs move into their community and having a disproportionate impact on their property tax rate. That's not a function of how efficient the school district is being run. It's it's the nature of these things.
Right. Let me shift gears a little bit. Actually, maybe go back a little bit towards the economic development thing we were talking about earlier. I've had the opportunity over the last couple of weeks to talk to several of the candidates for governor. Why they want the job is one good question. I've often been tempted to ask them, but anyway, they all seem eager to try and get into the big office there. One of the questions that's come up with each one of them I've talked with is this whole issue of broadband, or expanding broadband capability around the state. Now, as you know, Governor Douglas announced the E-State initiative back, I think, in 2007 or thereabouts, with the goal of having the state sort of fully wired by the end of this year, and I guess that goal is not going to be met. But there's still a wide consensus that having broadband capability, high-speed internet connections everywhere in the state, not just in major towns, but in small villages and up dirt roads and stuff, would be a good idea for the economy of the state, since, in theory, having that kind of telecommuting capability would be one way the state could develop economically. And the big question, or the fault line, seems to be whether or not we continue to rely on sort of private enterprise companies like Fairpoint and Vermont Telecom and places like that to handle that, or is this the equivalent of rural electrification back in the 1930s, that it's so important that the state ought to really oversee it? What is your feeling on that? Do you think that the state should step in and take a very active role, a more active role than it's doing now, or should we kind of have a more hands-off approach?
Well, Andrew, let me start off by saying that broadband is absolutely critical to our state's economy and the future of our economy. And in fact, when I left Vermont when I was 18, I moved to Chicago to start my career, and I spent the next decade trying to find a way to move back. And the opportunities in my field of expertise just weren't here. And it was a very frustrating experience because this is my home and I really wanted to live here. And the thing that allowed me to move back to Vermont was the internet. I would not be in Vermont today if it were not for the internet. And more specifically, having access to broadband where I live. I am a telecommuter. I work for a company based in Bozeman, Montana, of all places. Certainly not a metropolitan area. And my company was founded over a decade ago, and we've since grown to an 800-person company with a worldwide presence, offices all over the world. And I'm the only employee in Vermont, and the only reason I am able to work here is because of my access to broadband. All my phone, video conferencing, audio conferencing, high speed, my internet, everything goes through my cable company. And it's really remarkable when you think back, 15 years ago in terms of what the internet has done for our economy. So for me, it's something that's personally very important to me. To answer your question, is this something that the state should have responsibility for? In essence, that's what the state did when we created the Vermont Telecommunications Authority a few years ago, and when the governor laid out his e-state initiative. Unfortunately, the goals of the Telecommunications Authority have not been met, and we haven't. I really haven't seen the Telecommunications Authority live up to the expectations, and there's been some turnover in terms of the leadership of that organization. So I think the short answer to your question is it's going to require a mix of both private as well as public investment, and we need to look at the Telecommunications Authority and its role and how we might be able to better leverage that organization and the funding behind the organization. The other unfortunate thing that happened was the situation with Fairpoint Communications. They're a big part of our telecommunications infrastructure in Vermont, and they certainly have some capitalization problems. The commitments that they had made around broadband still hold. I've been in regular communication with the folks over there as it relates to their deployment plans within my district. But it certainly makes it challenging for them to expand beyond those commitments that they made when they purchased the business from Verizon. But it's critical to their long-term success. They cannot survive as a telephone company. They can only survive as a telecommunications provider, offering a wide variety of services, principally based around an internet backbone. It's critical to their business, and it's an imperative. It has to happen.
So one way or another, ways will be found, I guess, to link someone at the end of that dirt road to the internet.
And we just need to find a way to make that happen a little more efficiently, and to ensure that the people on the last mile are served and not left behind.
Right. Well, Oliver, we're just about out of time, but I just wondered, was there anything we didn't touch upon that you feel was really important to mention, or that you'd like the audience to hear, or if not, how do they get in touch with you if they have a question or a complaint or a problem?
Certainly. Well, actually, one of the things I enjoy most about the job is helping constituents, and I do receive quite a bit of correspondence, phone calls, emails, letters from constituents, and there's a real satisfaction in being able to help someone out with a problem, whether it's with government or even outside of government, where I can step in and help someone out, and that's something that I really do enjoy about the job, and I would encourage anyone to contact me. My phone number is 444-9004. My email address is oliver@oliverolsen.com, and Olsen is Olsen. And I also have a website, which is www.oliverolsen.com. Okay. And during the legislative session, I publish a regular email newsletter, and you can go to my website and sign up and That's how I try to stay in touch and keep people up to date with what's going on.
All right. Well, Oliver, thanks for stopping by. It's been a real pleasure talking with
Excellent.
you, and good luck the rest of the way.
I appreciate it, Andrew.
All
Pleasure
right.
being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you all for listening. And this has been another edition of The Front Page. My name's Andrew McKeever, Managing Editor of the Manchester Journal. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.